Okay, I'm going to try to do something a little bit different today. We're going to go through a video. This is a video called Something Funny Happened on the Way to the Moon. This probably kind of kick-started quite a few skeptical careers after watching this, like Phil Plait, the bad astronomer, because he wrote a book based off, I think based off this, or another document. Well, you calling this a documentary is kind of a stretch, but this was made by Bart Sibrel, who's actually most known for being hit by an astronaut. Afterwards, he tried to force Buzz Aldrin to swear on the Bible that they actually didn't go to the moon. And Buzz is a very religious person and walked away. And Bart kept trying to bug Buzz, and Buzz knocked him down with a one punch. So we're going to go through some of the claims in this video. I had to do a little research to get refreshed on what about the video. But yeah, there was a lot of and this also started probably Bad Astronomy, the website, and the Bad Astronomy and Universe Today forums, and quite a few other things. And people still are not discussing it directly, but a lot of conspiracy theories are based off of this. The Flat Earth cites a lot of the stuff that's in this, so we'll go through. We'll go watch parts of it, and then I'll explain what's going on. I'm not the selector of the music. Bart is. This is all World War II footage and atomic bomb testing.
Since the beginning of recorded history, the human race has been at war. First with members of their own family, then their fellow countrymen, and finally nations at large. Yet perhaps the starting ground for all these conflicts lays somewhere deeper within the very character of the human condition, in the dark, untouchable crevices of the human heart. It is said that the first iniquity of free will began even before the maiden pilgrimage from the embryo, preceding the very creation of the earth itself, in the forelife of souls in the heavenly realms. The dawn of warfare, some believe, was initiated by a fallen angel whose trespass against God was pride. In ancient Babylonia, in an age so long ago that the exact millennium remains in question, the Tower of Babel began construction. It was to be the single greatest achievement of the human race. A tower so tall that its summit would reach the heavens, and by it prove to the world that their race was superior. It would be God's irony that it would never be finished. Time passed, nations fell, a machine age emerged, and once again the ingenuity of the species which held dominion over all others unveiled what was at the time the most monumental accomplishment ever imagined, the largest machine yet constructed, an automation so mammoth and so revered even before its first demonstration that its only befitting name was Titanic. On April 10th, 1912, it set sail. It was boasted to be the ship that God himself could not sink. It would be God's irony that the very element that was meant to keep it afloat would cause it to sink. Water, frozen water, in the form of an iceberg. Not even
An iceberg in the North Atlantic in winter, or early spring, go figure. Plus, you don't want to go down there in a sub controlled by a PlayStation controller. A little too soon.
In one voyage did it complete. And then the next age embarked into the annals of human history. Perhaps the last age, the space age. Competition for victor was unparalleled. Powerful nations spent billions in unabashed rivalry to outdo the other. The Soviet Union launched the first orbiting satellite, the first animal, the first man. They had logged 500% more hours in space than the United States. And in June of 1969, they launched an unmanned probe to the moon to retrieve the first soil sample from another world, just 1 month before Apollo 11. That's how close the race was. Had their unmanned probe not crash-landed into the lunar surface, the first moon rock brought back to Earth would have been by the Soviet Union. Richard Nixon.
By then, Apollo actually already had Apollo 8 orbiting the moon. With the, what is it, what level, and I can't think of the other two, and if anybody's seen the movie Apollo 13, Lovell was in orbit of the moon again, but they didn't land on the moon, but they already had men orbiting the moon by then.
President at the time, had this to say about the latest work of the human hand. It is the greatest week since creation, the greatest event since the laying of the foundation of the seas, since the origin of the universe itself, since the design and formation of the delicate human eye through which all these things are perceived, was a flying machine with its 2 passengers landing on its closest celestial neighbor and returning from where it came. Perhaps again, God's irony lies somewhere within this great boast of humankind. The building of the tallest tower for the sole purpose of standing out among the races was never finished. The machine that was so great that it was said to be untouchable by even God never completed its first voyage. And finally, the crowning achievement of humankind, the greatest boast of the species, the event in human history most associated with pride in our own accomplishments, landing on the moon. 20 years later, and years behind schedule, the same space program couldn't put into Earth orbit a telescope with a lens that focused.
The thing about the Hubble not being able to focus, I found this out when I was waiting for a colloquium at a university I was attending, is that the company who was building the lens actually didn't report that the lens was, or not the lens, the mirror was bad, because they didn't want to redo the mirror and it would cost them money. So that's why there was the issue with the lens, with the mirror. But they did put a corrective lens on the Hubble telescope and it worked. But it wasn't the technology, is more a business decision than the technology.
And yet 2 decades earlier, a mission 100 times more complicated worked on its first occasion. With close...
No, there were many trials before Apollo 11. Like there was the Mercury and Gemini program to get people into orbit. And then there was Apollo 1, which was a failed test and killed the 3 astronauts there of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and again I can't think of all 3. But they died because it was an 100% oxygen-rich atmosphere in the spacecraft, and a spark lit up because somebody didn't correctly do the wiring. And another thing that is Velcro was highly flammable, and there was a lot of Velcro in the spacecraft to help them place objects and keep them in one spot because there's no gravity in space.
Scrutiny of the motives of the zealous Nixon administration, a critical examination of the entirely government-controlled press coverage, and newly discovered footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission, we wish to detail what may come to be the greatest government conspiracy of all time. A funny thing happened. on the way to the moon.
Trip in my rocket ship. We'll have a lovely afternoon. Kiss the world goodbye, and away we'll fly. Destination moon. We'll travel fast as a light till we're out of sight. The earth will be like a toy balloon. What a thrill you'll get riding on my jet. A destination moon. We'll go up, up.
What is it,
up,
SpaceX footage?
Straight to the moon we two. High in the starry blue. I'll be out of this world with you. So away we'll steal in my space mobile. A supersonic, a honeymoon. Leave your cares below, pull the switch, let's go. A destination moon.
Here they're showing a lot of the failed launch attempts by rockets before they finally figured out how to do it. And that's part of science and engineering, is you've got to build something, is you got to experiment to figure out what's going on. Yeah, I made a wisecrack about SpaceX because they're doing the same thing now. But that's what this is just... But this is showing all the failures, and they don't show the successes. Too. We'll be high in the starry blue. I'll be out of this world with you. So away we'll steal in my jet mobile. A supersonic, a honeymoon. Leave your cares below. Pull that switch, let's go. Destination. We're flying high up in the sky. Destination moon.
Dr. von Braun, how would you say we stand in relation to the Russians, and do you think we can ever catch up?
I'm convinced that in the space field, the Russians are ahead of us, particularly in large weightlifting capability. And that at the moment, the problem is not so much to catch up, but first build up the working speed that they have already demonstrated. After we are running as fast as they do, there's still a considerable gap to close, and only the future will tell whether we'll manage to close that gap.
We cannot and will not ever get into this race as we should, so long as all of our objectives are short-term objectives. We've got to have no finite end to our objectives. The end of our objectives should be as far as we can see at any given time. But right now, we need a 10 to 12-year program that has as its ultimate goal the manned domination of space. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
We must assure our preeminence in the peaceful exploration of outer space, focusing on an expedition to the moon in this decade.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting. We passed T-minus 60. 55 seconds and counting. Neil Armstrong reported back when he received the good wishes. Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight. Good luck and Godspeed. 40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Okay, this is the launch of Apollo 11, and Bart put images of some of the tragedies like famine and the war and such things. A lot of that is political and has not. Here's the thing: the Apollo 11 program was one of the reasons they did it was to get up on the Russians. It was a part of the Cold War. They were in competition. Which way is going to see it? Capitalism and democracy over socialism or over communism. There's a difference between socialism and communism. So that's why the Apollo program, they spent so much money on the Apollo program. But a lot of people still go, well, if we didn't have the space program, we can spend all this money on people. You can do both. It's just a matter of choice, what you want to spend your money on. The Americans put a lot of the money in defense. And yes, lately there's a certain president that's been grumpy that they think other countries are not pulling their weight, but there wasn't kind of an agreement between countries that the U.S. would build the giant military and the other countries would build their own militaries to a point, and they'd work together. So
Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo.
here's the thing about the Van Allen radiation belts. It's not a super dense cloud of radiation. Plus, when you're passing through it, it's more your dosage. Plus, it's a type of radiation. The type of radiation in the Van Allen radiation belt is mostly what they call alpha particles, which is the nucleus of helium atoms. And it can be blocked by a very thin layer of material. They also bring up later fast-moving electrons. Uh, but that's something different. But it's most of these helium nucleuses or alpha particles are coming from the sun, and are byproducts of the fusion reactions going on in the sun, and it gets trapped by our magnetic field. Without the magnetic field, a lot of this stuff would come down through the atmosphere, and probably would have made life a little bit harder for life on Earth.
The more experienced Soviets spent 100 hours in space for every 20 hours of the US. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. The mammoth Saturn V rocket used by Apollo was already 35 stories tall and weighed as much as a battleship. To add additional tonnage in the form of a lead barrier completely surrounding the crew members would have made it impossible for the vehicle to get off the ground. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum.
In future, to go to places like Mars or anything further afield, they do have to build up the shielding around where the people are going to be, or humans. Some things are just like going to be like you could build a layer of water with two halls, an inner and outer hall, and place a water which would capture most of it. But the best way of doing it, the way they think now, is just to try to get to Mars as fast as possible. But yeah, and another thing, yes, the Russians may have had more experience, but the Americans were willing to do anything to get there.
In 1998, the space shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect, not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects.
Well, here's the thing. The radiation they're calling here is beta radiation. It's a fast-moving electron. If a fast-moving electron goes through your body, it emits an X-ray. This is actually what causes X-rays. Is an X-ray gun or projector or whatever you want to call it sends a beam of electrons through your whatever they're trying to image, like your teeth, and when they go through, it gives off X-rays. It can build up a charge, but it's more the damage to the atoms and the molecules in your cells that will cause problems, and you'd have to have a fairly high dosage to do it. But this could also cause like cancers and stuff like that. But yeah, it is something that they have to keep an eye on. But we also on Earth get dosages of radiation from exposures to certain minerals and stuff in our daily lives.
President Kennedy, a man of political, not scientific background, set the irrevocable goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, just days after America's first astronaut had spent a mere 16 minutes in space, not even achieving a single orbit around the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful.
The technology necessary to launch the massive Saturn V rocket and an intercontinental ballistic missile is 95% similar. When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. When they also put the first animal in space, then the first man in space, then achieved the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, and the first ever of 2 simultaneously orbiting spacecrafts, concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up.
President, a member of Congress said today that he was tired of seeing the United States second to Russia in the space field. I suppose he speaks for a lot of others. What is the prospect that we will catch up with Russia and perhaps surpass Russia in this field?
However tired anybody may be, and no one is more tired than I am, it is a fact that it's going to take some time, and I think we have to recognize it. They secured these large boosters, which have led to their being first in Sputnik and led to their first putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able to carry out our efforts with due regard to the problem of the life of the man involved this year. But we are behind.
If it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In World War II, for example, columns of inflatable tanks were placed at locations afar from Normandy to draw German forces away from the real location of invasion. The Star Wars missile defense program rigged tests to make it seem more advanced than it really was. That's the conclusion of the General Accounting Office. The aim was to fool the Soviet Union about US military readiness during the Cold War.
Okay, about the inflatable tanks, yes, that did happen, and that's part of war, is deceiving your enemy to fake them out. Plus, another thing they did for that was they made General Patton the head of that army, and because the Nazis actually had got a good deed on it, actually had respect for Patton, and that's why they put Patton in charge of it. Plus, Patton got people angry at him. And about the Star Wars, I don't know if they did that for Star Wars, but it's possible. They did all kinds of things to fake out the Russians at this time.
Certainly, it was not possible to fool just the Soviets about US strategic capability in the 1960s, while somehow informing 200 million Americans of the truth secretly. In order for them to believe the United States had the capability to go to the moon, everyone would have to believe it. Furthermore, the pride of a nation was at stake, and the goal of a martyr, not to mention the growing unrest domestically of a government throwing tens of thousands of lives away in a foreign war riddled with contradiction and ambiguity. In addition, the Apollo program had already spent billions of dollars. If it failed to achieve its goal with such an investment, it would indeed be a large and bitter pill for the taxpayers to swallow. The cost of the program, whose sole goal was to be the first to plant a flag on the lifeless rock just outside the Earth, if adjusted for inflation to the 21st century, was $135 billion. With a profit margin of just 7%, this would be equal to over $9 billion profit going to the privileged contractors chosen by their friends at NASA. If the machinery was in fact only achieving Earth orbit, as other earlier missions had already done, then the completion and functionality of the other components would not have been as important, and even more profit would have been made. $135 billion could feed 2 million people for their entire lives. It could also buy 2 million two-bedroom houses. Yet how could such an undertaking be kept secret, and for such a long time? To the latter, one needs only to remember that an unsolved riddle 6 years older, the assassination of President Kennedy, still daunts the minds of the vast majority of Americans. As a parent of a conspiracy, as his assassin being assassinated himself, the truth of the matter has still escaped history. In keeping a secret of the magnitude of the Apollo missions being fraudulently created, one turns to the Manhattan Project for comparison. Surreptitiously building the first nuclear bomb during the early to mid-1940s involved 129,500 people over a 3-year period. Yet the secret did not get out. A quarter century later, the art and technology of espionage inevitably improved.
Okay. The Manhattan Project was known, and there were spies at the Manhattan Project. There was one guy named Carl Fuchs who got the plans for it snuck or sneaked out of the probably neither a word, but he hid the plans in the tires of his car and drove them out and sent them to the Russians. A lot of people who've watched The Big Bang Theory have probably heard of a guy named Richard Feynman. He's actually a very famous astronomer, not astronomer, physicist. But he was one of the junior scientists at the Manhattan Projects, and he actually borrowed Carl Fuchs' car. And on one trip, 3 out of the 4 wheels he had to replace or fix while he's visiting his wife in Albuquerque because she had TB. There was 400,000 people working on the Manhattan, not on the Manhattan Project, on the Apollo program. So the idea of that nobody would have blown the cover of the Apollo program is silly. And JFK was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. It's just this is the way the conspiracy theorists think. It's like, oh my God, it can't be just this one person who was crazy. But it's just the way they think.
Narrowing dramatically the number of players in the know of a large clandestine operation. Just 1 year before the first mission to the moon, NASA launched the Tetra satellite, specifically designed to simulate flight data coming from the moon, so that the ground crews could rehearse the landing, much as the astronauts did in their own simulations. Had it not supposedly fallen back to Earth, all that would have been needed during the actual flight would be a repeat of one of these computer programs, with a few original variations, transmitted to the satellite for rebroadcast to Houston. Scores of computers and their deceived operators on the ground would then receive prearranged information, including the alleged location, altitude, and fuel consumption of the spacecraft, as if it...
Here's the thing, it wasn't just the operators at NASA that was looking at this stuff. There was the Russians, and they were keeping an eye on the data coming back. Plus, before the Tetra satellite, there was a bunch of satellites called the Ranger programs and Surveyor. Ranger was mostly just flying by the moon, and Surveyor landed on the moon. So there was plenty of stuff going on before this, and the other people observing it as well.
If it were descending to the moon's surface. If the Soviets tried to find the actual location of an Apollo crew in the hundreds of thousands of miles surrounding the Earth and the moon, it would be tantamount to trying to find a rowboat in the Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture.
This was more due to politics than it had to do with keeping a secret. Most congressmen said, okay, we'll help fund Apollo, but you have to build a facility in Houston, Texas, or in Huntsville, Alabama, or different spots throughout the states. That's what plus there were already some independent sites like the Jet Propulsion Laboratory was already doing stuff before NASA came about.
And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public were strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true?
Oh yeah, a lot of the transmissions wasn't actually received by NASA. It was received in Australia, because when they landed on the moon, the other side of the Earth was visible from the moon, and there was the Parkes Observatory, radio observatory, was the ones that received the transmissions.
And what of the photographs? What do they tell us? On 3 separate occasions, our office asked NASA's Public Relations Department for every single picture of an astronaut on the surface of the moon, just during the maiden voyage of Apollo 11. Many duplicates were sent. In all, fewer than 20 pictures were found, including first-hand investigation on site at the agency's vaulted archives. Quite surprising, considering the historical significance of the event. These very photographs are the same ones circulated year after year on anniversary commemorations. It is estimated that in just the first 60 minutes on the moon, motivated by the tenuous nature of the circumstances, many more exposures could have been expediently taken. Also surprising is the scarcity of photographs of the mission's chief pioneer, Neil Armstrong. The greatest achievement in human history, and of the man whose first step echoed around the world, dawning a new age of scientific enlightenment, there is only one full-body picture of him on the moon.
Okay, if I was the first explorer going to a new land, I wouldn't take many pictures of myself. I'd be taking pictures of the new land. So that makes sense. Plus, when you stumble into a new area, you're not going to be you're going to take some pictures, but you're also going to be looking around, seeing how it looks like and stuff. Okay, and all the photographs that were taken by the Apollo program are available on NASA's website, or you just have to Google search it, and you can get a lot of the images taken for the program.
Besides this ghostly reflection, this one, taken by an automatic camera mounted on the side of the lunar module. Perhaps he feared liability should the whole conundrum later become unraveled. Perhaps he has forgotten that he attested to the authenticity of the event with his signature on this plaque engraved by the federal government. In fact, in the more than 30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, he has never given one on-camera interview to anyone, ever.
He was a very private man. He has passed away, but after NASA, he went to work at a university in Ohio and had a farm in a rural area in Ohio. Some people don't like being in the press. It's one of those things. He probably enjoyed doing the job, and after he did the job, he didn't want to make it about himself. There's some people who have to make everything about themselves, but he wasn't one of them.
From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example.
It depends on the situation, actually. If you're on a hill and something's not on the hill, the direction of the shadow will be completely different, and it could also be where the object is compared to the sun. So if the two objects are 90 degrees from each other, the shadow from the objects will have shadows that are 90 degrees to one another. It's just, it's kind of simple, but yeah, if you have two poles like that are arranged in a similar location, they'll probably be parallel.
In these seldom seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light.
That is just due to the hot spot is due to just difference in material. I think right before they landed, they had to scoot over a little bit to land, so the jets could have dispersed the material. But but it doesn't mean it's an artificial light. It's just a different shade. Plus, also you can see that some of the stuff in the foreground, there's shadows and stuff. That could just be stuff in the foreground are more susceptible to shadows, and you got a different terrain in the foreground or in the background. Sorry, but
it would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hot spot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be?
Reflection would be my first answer. It could be light reflected off the surface of the craft. That'd be my guess.
Or this, on the shadow side of the lunar module. In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably.
Okay, I had to look up this on the Clovis website, which is Jay Winley's website. He's probably one of the best persons about the moon hoax. That is probably a hair that was on or a fiber that was on the photographic paper at them when they made the photograph, and when they went back to the original, they wasn't there. If you were a prop master setting up a scene like that, you wouldn't leave something that marked quite clearly as that. That's what happened to the sea.
Probably airbrushed out. Here, a crosshair, which was burned directly into the image from the film plate, and thus should always appear on top of the objects in the photograph, appears behind the object in this scene. Clearly,
a lot of these photos are copies of copies, or they're not the original negatives. So that could have been why that's here. I'm not a photographic expert, but that's could have been what happened.
Revealing a composite of two pictures into one. Someone apparently forgot to create a burn crater underneath the lunar module's 10,000-pound thrust engine, despite the fact that during ground tests there was a real concern for the vehicle falling into the hole the engine created.
Here's the thing: the thrust would have stirred up a little bit of material, probably, but not that much, because there's no atmosphere to keep it floating in the air. So if it did, it just came up and down. Plus, there wouldn't be much of I don't think they were running that hot, but so that's probably why there's not a burn pattern. Plus, it's rock and it doesn't have much carbon in it, so there wouldn't be any carbon scoring or anything like that in there.
As it descended. Here is a depiction based on the latest specifications and scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there, not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights.
Plus, also, right before they touched down, they probably cut the engines and just drifted down. It kind of drifted down. Plus, there was a sensor on the bottom of each of them that gave them about maybe a foot before they actually touched down. So they probably shut off the engines before and let any dust that probably settled.
Had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere. And what about stars? On the moon, with no atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly, creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately.
Can you see the stars during daytime? When they were on the moon, they were actually during the lunar day. So if you can't, you wouldn't be even without, like on Earth, what causes the blue sky is the atmosphere, the light scattering. Even if you didn't have the light scattering, the sun would be an awfully bright object on the moon, seen from the moon. So it would overpower all the light from the stars. Plus, the cameras they were used had a setting for a certain light level, and it wouldn't be able to pick up the stars.
Much less realistically, a competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars, ever. In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon.
Michael Collins was never on the surface of the moon. They had Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong on the moon. The way the Apollo worked is you had somebody stay in the command module orbiting the moon. So he probably, if he orbited the moon and went to the dark side while they were on the surface, he could have seen stars.
It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to...
The cameras were preset to certain levels, plus they had pretty bulky gloves, so trying to fiddle with the camera settings while dealing with gloves is quite a challenge. Even using thin gloves that most people use, it's hard to set modern cameras, so that's probably why they didn't take pictures of the stars.
To the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized.
Again, you wouldn't be able to really see them because of from the glare from the sun, and plus there's also the reflected light from the Earth would have affected the optics as well.
If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going?
To engineers and companies on Earth. You got to imagine there's 400,000 people, so it cost a lot of money to hire a lot of these people, and a lot of them were like people who sewed buttons onto the seats and installed transistors into the computer circuits. The $60 million for each of the vehicles, they were specialized vehicles for specialized tasks, and they were also made to fold up into the landing module. So, okay, probably not the best spending of money, but compared to some other people, it's actually was worth it.
Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts in.
Assuming that it was done in a photographic studio. Okay, and about the flag moving, you can see the guy twisting it with his hand. And they had a rod in it to keep it kind of out. But these are a lot of assumptions based off of their pre-existing ideas.
Inside, after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny.
I see a guy handling the flag, and it's moving because he's moving the flag.
To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion.
There's also the height of the jumps and stuff, which can't be done, explained just by slow motion.
You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen color television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution color video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV.
Okay, as I said before, the station that actually intercepted the signal was in Australia. So they had to send it from Australia to Houston, probably through copper lines. They just didn't have really that great technology to send it to each of the broadcasters. That's it. And about different. Plus, it's also probably the reason why there's black and white was done from the surface of the moon. It's probably it took a lot lower bandwidth to send the black and white images than it did to send color images. So they only had so much power on the Apollo landing module compared to the command module. So they only used black and white cameras.
TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all, it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven. And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr., and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th, and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. We're coming in on Earth.
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it.
Okay, there's the way the communications usually ran between the astronauts and mission control was, it was another astronaut there that talked back and forth, and that they'd probably just say, reminding Neil to say something. Nothing much.
And their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private.
A lot of that background is them checking on, like all the astronauts had probes on them for medical reasons, and making sure there's enough oxygen in the cabin, and just general housekeeping things for them to keep an eye on during the mission.
Until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we were seeing. Thank you very much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form two different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Okay, there's no proof that they were just a few hundred miles up, and the cutting of the crescent, that's just them inserting what they want to insert to make it look like that. But you can actually move cameras, because in the future they'll show the camera's been moved to the back of the spacecraft, but they probably had it up close near the window to take these images and moved it back moved it around during the process of taking this video. I think this went more for playback for training and stuff than TV audiences, but could have been for TV audiences too.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue gas, see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away?
According to the narrator, but there's no proof that they were in low Earth orbit and then suddenly close to the moon. It looks like they were they were on the way to the moon or getting close to the moon.
Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway. It thus confirms that the stumbling block to their success was the lethal radiation of the Van Allen radiation belts. Since the same equipment was used on the subsequent missions in the 40 months that followed, none of them could have gone to the moon. They only increased their proficiency at staging them. When some TV viewers of the second manned mission to the moon telephoned the networks complaining that reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted, it became clear that for the taxpayers, once was enough. But it wasn't enough for the government and contractors. Billions of dollars of pure profit went with each return. How coincidental that the following mission would have the element of life and death jeopardy.
To me, it's pretty scummy to try to think that these guys were out for profits and put people's lives at risk, just to make the money. It's a lot of these the contractors were also airplane manufacturers, especially for the Vietnam War. So it's one of those low tactics.
Apollo 13. Now the public would take going to the moon more seriously and be reconnected with the drama. We now realize that perhaps the reason Neil Armstrong has never given an on-camera interview is because he doesn't want to lie anymore. What threats may have been made upon such honorable men or their families to possess their reluctant cooperation and later ill feelings towards perpetuating this still darkened hour in American history? NASA's highest-ranking official, James Webb, resigned without explanation just days before the first Apollo mission. Why, when he was on the threshold of achieving the greatest accomplishment of his career?
The reason why he retired early is because he was a Democrat and was associated with Kennedy and Johnson. Nixon was just voted into office, and he resigned so Nixon could put his own head of NASA in. That's all it was about, is just politics.
All 3 Apollo 11 astronauts also resigned shortly after their return.
That was the top of their career. Most of these guys were in their 30s and 40s and were in the military beforehand, and got a bump up to at least captain in the Navy or colonel in the Air Force. So they were pretty close to retirement for military personnel at the time. So that's probably why they retired.
On the 25th anniversary of the event in 1994, Neil Armstrong made a rare public appearance and held back tears as he spoke these brief cryptic remarks before the next generation of taxpayers as they toured the White House.
Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
This is basically saying there's more to do in space than what we've already done. And we've only started. Right now we're back into trying to go back to the moon and build bases so we can have long-term research on the moon, and especially in the South Pole, because near the South Pole there's a big crater called Shockley crater, and it's deep enough there where water can exist permanently, or ice can exist permanently. And he's just trying to inspire the next generation of scientists and to build the new infrastructure.
He is that layer. Perhaps someday soon, with the uncovering of this footage and its meaning, the true patriots of America will rise up or come forward and free the citizens and themselves from the sin that so easily entangles, and from a federal government that needs to have the gangrene cut off. Even if the government's destruction would come from the truth, then it is not worthy to stand, and its betterment would inevitably follow. All of us are mortal. All of us will die. Perhaps the seeking of a clear conscience before that hour will motivate the truth into the light. Perhaps as citizens we should offer amnesty for this and other crimes of history, for facts from those involved before the truth perishes with them. Why must we wait until the year 2017 to open the Kennedy assassination files?
That's standard policy, I think, for a lot of top secret documents. Is they have to allow 50 years before they can open them up. Right now, they're opening up because the current president of the United States is a conspiracy theorist. And his associate is also a conspiracy theorist. Okay. Conspiracy theories existed before this, but and people believed the moon hoax was fake before this. I actually had had family members who thought this was a hoax. But I think this kind of sparked off the last 20 years of conspiracy theories and that went along. We've had like the anti-vax movement. We've had or lately flat Earth for the last 10 years. And yes, we're still arguing flat Earth, and there's some scummy individuals in there that are making money off of the few people who actually believe in it. And they had the final experiment where they went to Antarctica with a few flat earthers and a few normal people and actually a higher percentage of flat earthers than percentage of normal people went, and that a lot of the fallout from that. I think this is near the end of this documentary. I may go back through some of the older conspiracy theories or some of the older videos to show where things started. I hope some people enjoyed this. Have a good day and goodbye.